Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to WatchBox, and thanks for logging on. It's that time again. We are waking up with watches, and I've got upgrades. Everything you see here is for sale. If you see a watch you'd like, reach out to tmosso at thewatchbox.com. Sales and trades, and we're counting down. Building up for the holidays. We need inventory, but the window is closing. Sell a watch or an entire collection, no upper limit on value paid. But again, the holidays are coming soon, and that is our end zone. Remember, reach out to tmosso at thewatchbox.com if you want to buy or sell a watch. Let's see some watches. Launched in 2013 and still very much my favorite Rolex Daytona. This is the 116506, also known as the 50th anniversary Daytona, a glittering combination of white platinum, the first ever series production platinum Rolex Daytona, chocolate Cerachrom ceramic bezel, chocolate registers, and Rolex's ice blue platinum exclusive sunburst dial. Now 40 millimeters as ever and 12.2 millimeters thick. This is a burly bruiser of a watch. Though not large, in platinum the feeling of mass is immense. The solidity of the bracelet, the clasp, the case, the solid platinum case back on this watch by itself weighs more than some ultra-thin dress watches. It is not big, it is not bulky, it is not a bully, but it has presence. An absolutely gorgeous combination of color and proportion, and a true event watch to celebrate 1/2 century of Rolex's most famous complication. Now, 100 meters water resistant, 3-day power reserve, certified chronometer, vertical clutch, and column wheel automatic winding. This is a versatile watch. That said, some folks need a little bit more water resistance, or perhaps they even want a more august history. From 1963 and the first Daytona, we turn back the clock a decade to 1953 and the first Rolex Submariner. This, as you can see, is the first generation ceramic bezel Submariner. Not a no-date sub. Technically, there are Submariners and Submariner dates. This is the Submariner. With no date, 300 meter water resistance, 120 click rotating bezel with ceramic insert, chronometer grade caliber, and of course the glide lock adjustment system. This is the closest living relative to the big crown subs that Sean Connery wore as James Bond. No date, diving bezel, diving crown, diving clasp, 20 millimeters of adjustment in 2 millimeter increments. This is as good as it gets. It's also remarkably thin at only about 12.6 millimeters thick. And remember, this one doesn't have the imbalance of the Cyclops eye on its dial. So the timepiece is just a little bit more symmetrical, a little bit flatter, a little bit more balanced bilaterally. You could cut it down the middle and it's symmetrical on both sides. It is a gorgeous looking watch, and on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist, it holds up to the legend. A timepiece that was created perfect, essentially out of the gate. All of the changes have been refinements. There is no planned obsolescence with these Rolex classics. In the year 2053, it'll still look like a Submariner. That said, some folks prefer something a little bit dressier, and they don't come much dressier than a tuxedo. This is the Datejust 36 116-200 with tuxedo dial. These are fantastic because you get everything that Rolex is: the history, the product integrity, the toughness, the water resistance, the precision, and the club scene, but you also get it without the generic quality that afflicts many of the mainstream Rolex watches, as this watch has a style all of its own. Start with the domed bezel, which is distinct from the conical bezel you usually see on Rolex steel watches, and then continue on to the dial, which is a combination of a lovely black gloss finish underneath white gold individual indices, and then center there's a silver, almost champagne sunburst. And wait, there's more. You get a true roulette date with the evens being black and the odds being red. This is a little Rolex watch with a ton of character and of caliber. Caliber 3135. Pop open the clasp, throw it on the wrist, and you can see that it's got quite a stance, presence. It makes an impression. It's not too big, it's not too small, it's classically proportioned, and as you can see, it does fit easily under a cuff. If you want to make this tuxedo dial your tuxedo companion, it will fit underneath a dress sleeve. And then of course you've got the 5mm easy link tool-free adjustment system built in. It's the equivalent of taking in or taking out one removable link. It has the same movement as the Sub, which means it's just as anti-magnetic, shock resistant, and accurate. Automatic winding with a 48-hour power reserve like the Sub. Now let's talk about high horology for a bit, and let's stick with our traditional sizes. Now lots of folks know the 5524G that came out in 2015. It was the Pilot Travel Time Calatrava. Your Calatrava Pilot travel time watch was a big hunk of 42mm white gold. And here's the thing, it didn't work for everyone's tastes. Some folks wanted the same look and functionality, but in more discrete proportions, and heck, let's add the warmth of red gold. And in 2018, we got exactly that. This is the 7234R, and it's 37.5mm in red gold. It is gorgeous, and as you can see, it includes all of the style, lines, and functionality of the 5524G Calatrava Pilot, which was white gold, big and bold. This is a watch that's better suited to my wrist size, to be perfectly honest. And if you're going to wear it as a dress watch, it always helps to moderate the size. But the functionality is unaffected. Gorgeous rose gold applique numerals on a brown bronze sunburst base. You can see there are two crowns. They are 1/4 turn releases, and the way this works is you turn them 1/4 turn and then you unlock the travel time function. So if you don't want it, you can hide that second hour hand, and when you do, you can bring it right out and adjust as you travel east or west. Now take note, what appears to be sub-seconds down at 6 o'clock is actually a radial date indicator. It has conventional center seconds, and it has AM and PM, that is day or night indicators for both home and local time, which is very cool because most travel time watches, you can see how that system works. Most travel time watches only give you an AM, PM for your reference time zone, the place where you are not. It's powered by a caliber 324, which means you're getting that classic handsome Patek Philippe finish, which is still more manual than most of its counterparts. There is obviously more handcraft going on here than you'll find at the likes of Glasutre Original, Jaeger-LeCoultre, or Audemars Piguet. The anglage is truly rounded and mirrored. It's started mechanically, but it's finished manually. The Côte de Genève are richly ridged. The screw heads are black polished. All of the screw and jewel sinks are polished to the same degree as the bevels, and then there's an engine turning on the base plate, the rotor center, and the reduction wheel adjacent to the winding center. So this is a good-looking movement, anti-magnetic silicone hairspring, tough, free-sprung balance adjusted in 6 positions. There is a reason Patek rates these for no worse than -3 + 2 seconds a day, and there are fringe benefits. This, the sportiest Calatrava, is also the most water-resistant Calatrava, being rated to 60 meters compared to the other watches' 30 meters. Sticking with Patek, but getting a little bit sportier, we're staying slim, only 8.6mm thick, of course. The Patek Philippe 5712 is a lovely and unconventional moon phase multi-complication with a micro rotor automatic inside the classic 40mm stainless steel Patek Philippe Nautilus case. Now you can see all the cues that Genta coined back in 1976, the integrated bracelet, the rounded polygonal bezel, satin on the top, polished on the sides, the symmetrical wings on both sides. And though the watch is rated as a 40, that's measuring from roughly here to here. If you measure it across from wing to wing, it's more like a 42.5, so it has quite a bit of wrist presence. On the dial, it is a very subtle gradient from silver or blue at the center to almost black at the edge. There's a moon phase, there's a date, there's a power reserve indicator, and then of course there's small seconds. Hands and indices are white gold. You do get a screw down crown, and the watch is 60 meters water resistant, so with a screw down crown, that is sufficient for surface swimming. We're gonna throw it on my wrist real quick so you can get a sense of it. It's much like the 5711. The 5726 annual calendar, the 5990 and the 5980 chronograph, they're all bigger and thicker. They feel like Nautilus offshores. So what the Royal Oak is to the offshore and the offshore is to the Royal Oak, the 5711 is to the annual calendar and the chronographs. This is more like the 5711 in terms of how it fits and feels. It has that same lightness. It has that same silken feel to the bracelet, which isn't excessively heavy or battleship anchor-like the way you get on some of the bigger Nautilus complications. You can also see how easily it slides under a cuff, and there is plenty of lume. This is a watch that has a lot to offer, as it also includes an upscale automatic. 5711 as well as the annual calendar, they're going to use a center rotor automatic based on the 324, or a much newer 5711 in the last year is going to use the 26330. This is the 240, which is the micro rotor auto, which gives you the big open view on the case back that you would get with a manual movement, but with the convenience of an automatic. It also gives you the thin profile of a manual movement. 48-hour power reserve, so it's a bit more than the 324 and its recent successor, the 26330. Free sprung silicone hairspring, getting all of those refinements and the 6-position adjustment. Same rated accuracy from the factory as the Calatrava Pilot we just saw, but again, this is a little bit more core to Patek Philippe, as the Nautilus is considered, along with the Calatrava line, the heart and soul of the company. An extensively hand-finished watch. You can see why the Nautilus costs such a premium over the Aquanaut. It's in the complexity of the case and the complexity of the finishing, both for the case and the bracelet, which is a rare sight indeed on the Aquanaut, and when seen, it is not finished with the degree of attention to detail that you find on a Nautilus bracelet. Now, speaking of a sports watch on a bracelet, this is already becoming a little bit of a cult watch. Second, in the H. Moser & C Streamliner series, for 2020, all new, we have the Streamliner Center Seconds with Matrix green dial. Now, if you're familiar with the opening animations of the Matrix, just after the credit, you always see those green scrolls of computer code. Well, that is the green that you find at the center of this dial, because this is a Moser Fume dial. That means it has a fade from bright at the center to dark at the edge. We have a material called Global Light, which is sort of a Luminova infused ceramic that's used to cap the hands. More on that in a moment. And you can see that black polished indices as well as hand centers have been used for this dial, which in incredible taste features a minimum of scripting. It doesn't even mention Swiss made. With Moser, you know the watch is going to be 90% Swiss made or more. And there's no date. The branding is handsomely executed. It doesn't need a tome on the dial. Rolex. So this timepiece, 40 millimeters in diameter, is actually only 12 millimeters thick, so it's thinner than it looks at first glance. It's got a 3-day automatic winding power reserve and a case that is distinctly different from the class of integrated bracelet sports watches that have come out over the last 18 months. You can see it looks nothing like the Nautilus, and that is all to its credit, as it's basically the same idea, but it's an original rendition on the concept. Too many watches coming out now look like the Nautilus with the Royal Oak. This has got a little bit of Ebel to it. It's got a little bit of Omega Speed Sonic Chronograph and maybe some Oris Chronoris Star. But the bottom line is it pays tribute to the 70s and the integrated aesthetic without plagiarizing anyone's particular history. There's a lot of original idea to be found in this watch, and I prize originality in an industry in which it is in short supply. Now, the case flanks are handsomely relieved. All Mosers have interesting case profiles. This is a little bit more mechanical, structural, technical, and sharp in appearance than what you'll find on the flank of, say, a Venture or an Endeavor, but you can see that the details are superb with a radial grain across the bezel top that radiates out from an imaginary center point on the dial. This is done with a lapping machine, and it's another nod to the peaks of 70s integrated bracelet design and tonneau case design, which is something neither the Royal Oak nor the Nautilus is. This is a tonneau, those are not. There's also a lovely degree of finishing. The bracelet has a flush countersink to it that means it fits together in a seamless fashion that's almost organic. It's like the rippling back of some sort of sea creature, or on land an armadillo, as it is fluid both in feel and appearance, with the highlights and the satin elements contrasting in a gorgeous manner. Throw it on the wrist. Let's throw it on the wrist real quick and get a sense of how it wears. It is smaller than the Streamliner Flyback, which is a much bigger watch at over 42 millimeters. While this appears to be a large watch in isolation, you can see on the wrist, in fact, it is not. It's right-sized, handsome, highly legible, well-loomed, classic, and formal enough that you could wear it as your dress watch and it would fit underneath the cuff. It's also 120 meters water resistant, which means with the screw-down crown, this 120 is a truly swimmable watch. And it's got a sports watch movement architecture with a full balance bridge and a free-sprung index, so it can take a hit. I don't mean abuse it, I just mean that this is not a delicate high horology movement. What it is Moser's own movement with a magic lever bidirectional winding system and a 3-day power reserve. It's nicely executed with double-crested Côte de Genève, satin and beveling on the balance bridge, black polished screws, and as you can see, both a satination and a media blasting on the rotor itself, which pivots on unlubricated ceramic bearings. Moser making the whole movement, including the hairspring, the escapement, and the balance. They're doing all of that in-house, and they're doing that on an annual production of about 1,500 watches, so they are heavily invested in the technology for the small number of watches they make. Let's take a quick look at a watch they launched last year, 42.8 millimeters in stainless steel. This is a 50-piece limited edition with burgundy fume dial. It is the Moser Pioneer Perpetual, and it is the month date. It is essentially the Andreas Streller designed perpetual calendar system that Moser features on its classic Endeavor Perpetual, but rather than the index at center coaxial with the hands, you have a proper date aperture that makes it more intuitive to read than the radial index that corresponds to the hours and the months. So what we have right here is a lovely fade from burgundy, almost almost a sort of pink metallic at the center to black at the edge, and you can see there's a flange outboard. I'll do my best to remove my offending fingerprints. I'm sorry about that. You can see that the dial is Lume, so this is a sports watch, and 42.8 millimeters in stainless steel with a 120-meter water resistance. This is also a sports watch in every regard. This is a true all-the-time watch that you never need to take off. Now, there's hacking seconds, there is a double quick set system for the calendar, and take note, I can adjust this calendar in both directions. It's a perpetual calendar that is bi-directional. Now, don't worry about the way the days are jumping right there. It behaves differently under its own power than when you're operating it with a quick set. There's a power reserve indicator over at 9 o'clock. We're going to screw that crown in real quick and take a look at the caliber 808. In-house, twin barrel, it's rated to run for 7 days, but reality is between 9 and 10 days, and that is German-Swiss watchmakers under-promising and over-delivering. There are gorgeous elements here, and just take note, the leap year phase indicator is on the back of the watch, so keeping everything clean, that indication that you don't need on a daily basis is hidden from the dial. It has a nice, slow, traditional pocket watch-like beat rate, 18,000 vibrations per hour, and refinements, well, you got them. Jewels set in screw-fixed chaton with blackened screws. Those double-crested Côte de Genève that are a signature of Moser finishing. You have a lovely swan's neck style spring for the click inspired by the pocket watch era. And although these are not truly a three-quarter bridge, you have the image of the three-quarter bridge split in half, obviously for easier servicing, but it's a nod to Moser pocket watches of the 19th century and early 20th century. You'll also love that the escapement is 14-karat gold to reduce friction, improve precision, and extend power reserve. And then there is an overcoil hairspring that is made by hand, and impressively, yes, Moser makes that hairspring as well. Now throw it on the wrist, it's got a lot of presence. At almost 43 millimeters, it's a big watch. But I could wear this comfortably and happily, as it's a combination of things I value: durability, practicality, and versatility. This is a watch that's got a lot of personality, and if you want something that's a little bit more discreet, maybe go with one of the darker dials, but this one is exuberant. This one is expressive, and if that sounds like you, this 50-piece limited series might be your watch. Remember I said Moser cases always have interesting profiles, and you can see that here, as the case is slightly scalloped and hollowed, but then sharply coined inboard. Every single Moser case has an impressive and invented case profile. Inventive and nicely distinguished, as you can see that there's a character line on the lug hood along with satination that contrasts with the polish of the flank. So no detail here, no facet, no square millimeter is overlooked. This is a fully realized concept. Okay, let's take a look at a watch that is bigger and possibly even bolder. This is a 250-piece, 45mm stainless steel 2020 limited edition. This is the Zenith Molten Pilot Type 20 blueprint. Now, Zenith was inspired by blueprints for its own manufacture that were discovered, and the dial itself is a representation of how a traditional blueprint for this exact type of dial would be supplied to a dial supplier. So there's a lot going on here, and perhaps the most interesting thing is the layers. You have a sapphire over the top, that's for protection, but then you have a secondary sapphire on which many of these features, such as the numerals, the outer scale, and the Zenith Star logo, are mounted so that they float above a blue dial base, giving it a three-dimensional look, and that is exactly what it is. It is three-dimensional, so you look deep into this dial. You can also see that it features lovely cathedral-style hands with a satin metallic polish on their top, and this is a great occasion to call in a Lume shot. But first, take a look at the case flank. You can see this is designed to celebrate the Molten, or pilot's watch styles of the 1920s and 30s. The Molten was also a cockpit clock made by Zenith that could be used on a flight deck as part of the equipment. The timepiece, of course, is styled to look like a vintage pilot's watch, and on the back you have the Louis Blériot monoplane, which is a fun way of reminding us that back in the 1910s, Zenith was already in the air. The whole case is 100 meters water resistant, and as the image of Louis Blériot flying over the English Channel obscures the contents, it is a Zenith Elite 679 automatic winding unidirectional stop seconds, 50-hour power reserve, and it is a thin, fine, high horology movement in league with the likes of, for example, the Girard-Perregaux 3300 or the JLC 889 and its derivatives. So it is a high-grade movement, and at 100 meters, this is solidly more water-resistant than you expect in a pilot's watch. We're not done yet. We're going from groups to independents and back. This is the best of independence. It is the brand I would buy for myself. When I resume collecting, it will be the brand I buy for myself. And this is an opus launched in 2011 by De Bethune of L'Auberson, from a company that makes at peak about 150 watches a year, and which has, in its entire history since 2002, built fewer than 2,800 watches. This is the signature DB28 floating lugs in titanium, but it is the tourbillon model. As you can see, black polished center over the barrels. You can see the bridges themselves almost like a piece of onyx in mirror polish. You can see that the bridges themselves, mirror anglage on the edge, Côte de Bethune on the base plate, black polished screws, black polished grade 5 titanium case, a tourbillon constructed of titanium with a white gold and silicon balance wheel, maximizing the mass in the rim, minimizing the mass of the rotor, reducing the thermal coefficient of expansion or contraction. And this is no mean tourbillon, as it has a 5-day power reserve via the 2 barrels, self-adjusting barrels with silicon, or I should say, with sapphire inner linings. They actually have sapphire sleeves inside the barrel to reduce friction. There's a power reserve indicator on the case back. You can see this is number 10. Only 29 DB28 tourbillon were made in 2011 when this model debuted. Now I'm going to do my best to wind it up right here because it truly is a sight to behold. The crown is a screw-down crown and it's remarkably secure. The watch is a bullhead winder, and with a 5-day power reserve, you don't have to wind it all that often, and it'll be a pleasure when you do. You can see on the hour track outboard of the center dial, there are individual globes of titanium, which have been black polished to create the image of mirrored spheres, and everything about this watch is over the top in style, in feel, in proportion, in design, in engineering. No fewer than half a dozen patents protect the technology in this watch. So when you buy a de Bethune timepiece, you know where your money's going. It's not going to enrich shareholders to buy sports cars or castles. It is going to build the next generation of de Bethune watches. I should probably wind this one up a little longer. One thing I should mention is that this watch really does need a wind. So when you interact with this watch, we've got a frame sampling rate thing that makes it look like it's beating less than it is, but the timepiece is absolutely manic, as you can see. It is beaten away at 36,000 vibrations per hour with a 30-second period. So it is a 30-second tourbillon. So it's once around every 30 seconds instead of the more conventional 1-minute tourbillon. This is better suited to wristwatch applications. You have a silicone escapement unlubricated. You have a bi-element hairspring, 2 pieces of hairspring clamped together, bent by hand, so it beats concentrically like an overcoil without the shock susceptibility of an overcoil. And you can see underneath the structure of the tourbillon carriage, which weighs only 0.18 gram, there is a mirrored underlay to allow you to appreciate the reflection of the underside of the carriage. This watch has it all. Throw it on my 16-centimeter circumference wrist, and you can see it wears surprisingly flat. At less than 12 millimeters thick, this really is a compact watch. It's 11.2 millimeters thick, and it is 42.7 millimeters with the floating lugs. And the floating lugs will always ensure you get the right fit on your wrist. This is beyond spectacular. It has the tech appeal of Richard Mille, but with the real watch investment and engineering prowess of a Grubel Forsey. This is a timepiece that sets the standard from a brand that is simply the best. Let's talk about 2 from a brand I happen to love. Now, when we talk about sports watches from Geneva, a lot of folks think Rolex. Maybe they think Patek. Perhaps these days they even think about the FP Jorn line Sport. But Vacheron Constantin has since 1996 continuously manufactured the Overseas, a model based on Jörg Heisig's design for the 1977 Vacheron 222. So this design has staying power, and we have both the first generation and the second generation of the watch right here. Now, the first generation is genuinely scarce, thin, fine, and highly sought. This all-Arabic military dial, as it's known, is the version to get. This is the version 42042. It is the second revision of the first generation Overseas. 8.4 millimeters thick, 37 millimeters in diameter, perfectly proportioned, chronometer certified, and 150 meters water resistant. This is not just a modern day classic and an emerging collectible. This watch, which was made from 1996 to 2003, is now on the verge of becoming a true vintage timepiece. It's powered by a Vacheron caliber 1311, which is a modification of a Girard-Perregaux 3100, which starts out as a thin, fine, and very accurate high horology movement. Vacheron then produces improvements to the robustness, the winding system, the finish, and the accuracy, adjusting it to earn a chronometer certificate in the overseas self-winding that you see right here. Now, the timepiece is an absolute riot of fine finish. As you can see, making up for lost time in the integrated bracelet sports watch market, Vacheron went over the top with faceting and hollows, dips and swells, bevels, satin, and polish. And you can see that they really overthought this bracelet, which is gorgeous to the point that they mirror polished it internally. I'll do my best to show you this, but they mirror polished it internally. They included a large number of removable links, as there are removable links on both sides, including a half link. You can see that the clasp itself is unusual in its construction in that, well, first it uses spring-loaded pin snaps, which were rare back in this era, but then it also has internally a switch and a lift lock. So you've got a clamshell and you've got a trigger to open it up. On the reverse side, the gorgeous image of the Italian naval training vessel Amerigo Vespucci. That was the image basis for this case back, which features circular satination, radial satination, chiseling, and polished relief of the waves, the logo, and the ship. Truly special. And again, 37 millimeters by 8.4 millimeters thick. Now, this is 12.6 millimeters thick by 42 millimeters. The second generation overseas chronograph was considered the second generation overseas to have. In addition to the original watch's 150-meter water resistance, we gained a Milgauss-like soft iron inner cage that endows it with 25,000 ampere per meter anti-magnetism. Remember, 4,800 ampere per meters is the ISO definition of an anti-magnetic watch, so this was far beyond. It's also larger. At 42 millimeters, you can see that the finish is similarly impressive, as there's beveling along the side of the case, satination on the lug hoods as well as the lug tops, polishing on the flank, and whereas the Maltese cross motif bezel is polished, note that the recesses inside are vertically satin finished. We have a little crosshatch type knurling on the crowns and the pusher shoulders, designed to remind you of the Maltese cross. Another Maltese cross logo on the dial, Maltese cross on the crown, and of course you can see the image of the Maltese cross on both the buckle and the chassis of the clasp. Now, the timepiece, of course, here is on a luxury Vacheron alligator leather strap. You're going to want to put it on a rubber strap before you take it in the water, but with 150-meter resistance, this is absolutely swimmable. Now, it's an easy watch to wear. In spite of being a 42 and a fairly sizable sports watch, it has that lug profile where the lugs dip down on both sides. You'll also note, in a nod to best practices, Vacheron is fixing this strap to the case using screws and bars, not spring bars. That's high horology. That's better security. That's how they should all be made. You see, the dial is blue lacquer. Let's get as close as we can here. The hands and the indices are white gold, so they never tarnish or oxidize. The dial is blue lacquer. There is a flange outboard for reading the minutes and the seconds, a double-digit date that became the signature of the early overseas chronographs. That was lost with the Generation 3, and a lot of folks lament the loss of that double date. You can see that there is calculated symmetry, as the chronograph minutes register at 3 o'clock is bigger than the chronograph hours register at 9 to make it more salient and easy to read. And inside is a Frederic Piguet 1185 doing business as the Vacheron caliber 1137. Automatic winding 40-hour power reserve, quick set date, vertical clutch, column wheel, 5-position adjusted, and hand finished. It is a machine worthy of the body. This is a timepiece that exhausts superlatives, and in steel with the blue dial, it is generally considered the best of the second generation overseas chronos, which, as I said, are the best second generation overseas, period. We're going to do a bunch of Lume shots toward the end, but we got to fly right now. Let's talk about sporty watches in various avant-garde materials, starting with the latest 44 millimeter titanium FP Jorn Octo Sport, 10.9 millimeters thick, feather light in titanium with, I should mention, a purpose-built aluminum Octa 1300 3 movement. This watch has it all. Now, what appears at first glance to be a printed dial is actually an applique dial, as the numerals are three-dimensional solid blocks of aluminova impregnated material. They are placed on the dial and create a wonderful luminescence that's three-dimensional in the dark. We have a yellow lacquer dial, and take note of the attention to detail, as the individual numerals have been bounded by black lacquer so that they pop better against the yellow base. We've got a red on silver flush set of date wheels, a smoked sapphire for constant seconds down at 6 o'clock, and You can see that we're going to pull this crown out here, and we're going to make sure the minute hand gets out of the way. There is a day-night indicator adjacent to 9 o'clock. That's what that little window is. You'll see it turns dark at night, and then it turns light as you make the journey from night into day. So now we are passing 6 o'clock, 7 p.m. in the evening. That's how that works right there. Ceramic bezel insert to help guard against shearing and scratches, and then you can see that this is sans bumper, as the rubber bumpers that many consider to be one of the aesthetic weak points of the previous watches are not here. I liked the bumpers, I'm not going to lie. That was my preference in terms of the design of these, but a lot of folks disagreed with me, and the market has spoken. Bereft of bumpers is the way you prefer it, and this is the latest style without the rubber appurtenances. Now the movement, I mentioned, it's aluminum. Indeed it is. All aluminum bridges and plates, which means that not only is this watch light without, it is light within. The movement has a chronometric power reserve of 120 hours for best timekeeping, but it will in fact run for almost 7 days at 160 hours. It's free sprung for toughness, and it's adjusted in a chronometer style, 5 positions, take no prisoner. Throw it on my wrist real quick so you can get a look at it. Again, the watch is large at 44 millimeters, but it is not heavy, nor is it thick. So if you want to wear this as your dress watch, or you want to wear it comfortably, rest assured, both are easy. This timepiece lends itself to ease, and you can see that from lug to lug it's not too broad across the wrist, so ease extends to ease of wearing. Now this was new for last year. For the first time, a crown on a Ulysse Nardin Freak. This is the Ulysse Nardin Freak X Carbonium, part of a 93-piece limited edition. The watch is 43 millimeters in carbonium, which is a carbon fiber composite. Now the timepiece features a carousel tourbillon, just like the original Freak. It's a little bit different from a tourbillon in that there are 2 different drivetrains. One powers the actual carriage, the other powers the escapement, and that's how I can move it around without crashing the escapement. So this was developed by Bonnie, I believe a Dane, in the 1890s. The carousel, a more durable version of the tourbillon that's better suited to, shall we say, high impact or vigorous applications. Now the watch is loomed, there will be a lume shot, but in addition to mentioning that this is the most water resistant Freak ever at 50 meters, the first ones were 0, later ones were 20 to 30. You also have a unlubricated proprietary silicone escapement through its Cicatec subsidiary. Ulysse Nardin makes its own silicone, so that is technically proficient in a way that even the LVMH watch brands cannot match. Now the balance itself is a fascinating free-sprung article. There's a silicone hairspring that's anti-magnetic, so this is basically an amagnetic watch with the silicone escapement and hairspring. It's free-sprung for toughness, and then the balance wheel is anything but a wheel. It's a series of almost, I would call them segmented cantilevers with masses outboard, and it even uses a little bit of aerodynamic braking to regulate itself. So it is a very sophisticated construction that is probably created using deep reactive ion etching to achieve a level of precision not possible with traditional CNC or handcraft. Now, as you can see, the minute hand is effectively the carousel body, and then the hour hand pivots beneath that. It's a fascinating planetary apparatus. As you can see underneath, there's a fixed ring against which the carousel planetary drives, making it absolutely engrossing to play with. At 43 millimeters, it's also the most wearable Freak since the 2001 original in 42.5. This is 43. It uses a bidirectional winding system, a magic lever methodology to wind the watch, meaning it's an automatic Freak, and in spite of the power-intensive refinement to that dial, it still has a 3-day power reserve. Very comfortable. The strap is a fusion of leather and rubber, and as you can see, everything is matted out, dark, black, stark, with a high contrast about the indices and the hands so you can read the watch in spite of the novelty of its construction. This is a very cool watch, and a lot of folks have already told me that this is already their favorite Freak. It is certainly the most wearable. We're not done with FP Jorn. We got a few more to go. I should mention that none of the FP Jorn watches on this show are listed on our website. So if you want to get on board with any of these, reach out to tmosso at thewatchbox.com. None of the Mosers or Jorns you see on this show are on our website. You're going to want to reach out to me if you're interested in inquiring about these watches. This is a Resonance 3. After 2009, FP Jorn decided that to make the watch more apt as a travel companion, instead of 2 12-hour dials, one would be in a 24-hour format, one would be in a 12-hour format. And truly, that does give you better insight into whether you're looking at, for example, 6:15 in the evening or 6:15 in the morning. You can see here it is in the evening, and that is the point of this asymmetrical dial style. Now, this watch, of course, is 40 millimeters in red gold. It's a Res 3, and if you're wondering why the seconds hands don't line up, it's because the resonance coupling of the two movements in this case takes about 7 to 10 minutes before everything is truly resonating and harmonically coupled. So you pull this little trigger down at 4 o'clock and it synchronizes the hands so that they are always in step. There's a 42-hour power reserve, and the power reserve indicator moves backwards, so 0 means fully wound. 0 hours since it was last wound. Gold inside, gold outside, and as you can see, the caliber itself, entirely 18 karat, meaning though 40 millimeters, this is a hefty watch. You can also see that the dial itself is white gold. So white gold, rose gold, and then caseback rose gold. This is a lot of precious metal. 2 independent movements, barrel, train, escapement, balance. There's no physical coupling between them. They start to resonate just as pendulums or metronomes placed in proximity. The parasitic emanations of friction radiating out from these 2 escapements will couple them together. And just to make sure it works properly, they're both adjusted in 6 positions, and then this little rack and pinion at the center with that gold pinion, it's used to adjust the distance between the balances to make sure it works prior to delivery. Throwing it on the wrist, you can see that this timepiece is flat, flush, comfortable, and only 48 millimeters from lug to lug. So it wears compact across the wrist, and I could recommend for a wrist as small as 13 centimeters circumference. So in addition to being a power watch, it's potentially a great unisex option. But wait, there's more. At 38 millimeters, considerably scarcer and considerably more collectible. This is an FP Jorn Tourbillon Remontoir 4th series. A timepiece 38 millimeters in platinum, it represents the first generation of FP Jorn's signature and founding tourbillon model. The first series, the subscription series, came out in 1999, and then between 1999 and 2004, he built out the rest of the first generation of the watch. They were more visibly handmade. They were slower to market. They were all somewhat experimental, as the combination of the remontoir d'égalité and the tourbillon carriage had never previously featured in a watch, but they are gorgeous in every case. As you can see, we have a tourbillon that is a 1-minute tourbillon, free-sprung with an overcoil. Overcoil is rarely seen on Jorn watches. That's a feature that is there for the sake of chronometry. It beats away at 21,600 vibrations per hour. It has a filigree-style wire tourbillon cage that's actually black polished on its top, and then a specular finished, continuously rounded tourbillon cock that's bolted to the dial, as is a small half bridge for the remontoir escapement, and we'll talk about that in a moment, but that's not necessarily a deadbeat indicator. That's part of the constant force device. As with the chronomètre Resonance, we have a reverse power reserve indicator that indicates 0 when fully wound. The dial is a lush gold. As you can see, it has a little bit of a shimmer on it. These early dials almost seem to be slightly varnished atop the metal base. Turning the watch over, you can see that this version of the caliber 1498 was brass. Rhodium plating on brass bridges, you can see that linear remontoir spring, so the barrel never drives the tourbillon directly, or at least it doesn't until the last 12 hours of runtime. But for about 28 hours of operation, the watch maintains constant amplitude because that remontoir spring meets out 1-second bursts of energy to the escapement. So the barrel for 28 hours is not going to drive the escapement. It is this spring and the energy invested in that spring, which you can see is moving very slightly and slowly with the release of its secondary escapement. And that is what actually energizes the tourbillon and endows this watch with chronometric purposes, not simply novelty. Most tourbillon watches are there to look cool. This one is actually there to tell good time, and as FP Jorn tells it, it's really the presence of the remontoir more than the tourbillon that achieves that purpose. So this is the first tourbillon remontoir 4th series, an absolute brass ring FP Jorn collectible, if ever there were one. Okay, let's pause and do some Lume shots, because I've had a lot of Lumed watches now. I'm going to show you what they look like in the dark. We've had a ton of sports-style watches, and I'm going to do my absolute best to indulge you with a long sequence of Lume shots, starting with the Submariner. Submariner No-Date, exactly the same as the Submariner Date by night. Blue chromalite Rolex Lume. 7234, this is the Calatrava Pilot from Patek Philippe. Surprise, surprise, the Freak X is actually quite well lumed, as you can see. It uses blue lume both for the dials and for the mobile elements, the hands, hours and minutes. We're going to take a quick look At the FP Jorn Octo Sport, as I promised, you have those solid blocks of Luminova, and that's exactly what those numerals are. They are three-dimensional. They have length, height, and width. Here is the Zenith Pilot Type 20 Cathedral Hands. Here is the Moser Pioneer Perpetual. Here is the Overseas second generation. Here is the Patek Philippe 5712. Two more to go. Here is the Overseas Generation 1 military dial. That is my winner. That is my winner. Differential lume color for the hands and the dial. And then that's the Globalite lume compound of the Streamliner center second. All right, that was exciting. That was also a little bit chaotic, but fun. How do we finish? We finish big. We finish the way we came in, with a lume shot. Do you already know the answer? Let's see if you were right. We have two from a Longo Zone, both Longo Ones of different size and complication. Starting with the year 2000 millennial Longo One tourbillon, 38.5 millimeters in rose gold. You can see it features the caliber L961 with a black polished skeletonized half bridge for the tourbillon, capped on both sides by a real diamond. You can see it's free sprung with an overcoil. It has a 3-day power reserve in spite of the energy intensive complication, and has all of the classic architectural elements of the standard Longo One, with the exception that sub-seconds has been moved to the primary dial. Now the watch is gloriously rendered on both sides, and you can see the freehand engraving of the underlying mechanism driving the tourbillon with a lovely spiral-style pocket watch-inspired set of wheel spokes, all satin finished. You can see that there's mirrored anglage on the edge of every bridge, and it's to an excruciating mirrored finish. It is not simply a beveled edge. This is as good as anything in the industry, and you can see the diamond capstone on the underside of the tourbillon carriage. 3/4 style bridge, nickel copper zinc, golden hued because of the copper content, that German silver material of which Longa makes its watches. I should also mention that this limited edition of 250 pieces includes a full rose gold clasp, a feature uncommonly included on Longa watches. Now, on my wrist, you can see it wears like a classic Longa One. It's still fairly thin, and at 38.5 millimeters, it's not only gloriously compact, it's almost modest for a tourbillon timepiece. That said, if you want to up the ante, then you want this. As you can see, this 40.9 millimeters in platinum is the 200-piece limited edition Grand Longo One Lumen. Not luminous, lumen. Smoked sapphire over the dial. You saw it before. It has a smoked sapphire not just so you can see the mechanism underneath, but so the individual discs for the date wheels can be pre-charged by emanations through the smoked sapphire. That's why it doesn't have a solid dial. Throw it on the wrist, you can see this is the second generation Grand Longo One case, which is 41 millimeters instead of the previous 42, or if we want to be accurate, 40.9 instead of 41.9. It's still a thin watch, and it fits underneath the wrist quite well. Operating the double-digit date is a pleasure. It has the same tactile satisfaction as a fine column wheel chronograph like the Datejust or the 1815. That informed the pusher feel. The movement is even more traditional and pocket watch inspired than what we saw on the Longo One tourbillon. As you can see, it has individual finger bridges for the terminal end of the drivetrain, which is a lovely refinement you do not get on a standard Longo One or Grand Longo One. You have that same engraving underneath the black polished swan's neck the 3-day reserve, twin mainspring barrels, and of course it is adjusted in 5 positions, the high horology and chronometer standard. Take a note, both black polished and fired blued screws, and you can see that the train as well as the barrels sit in those golden chaton held in place by screws. You have that same degree of mirrored beveling and engine turning on the base plate, glasuta stripes across the bridges, and my goodness, doesn't this one simply fit a treat? Not too big, not too small, not too tall. This thing has it all. And you can have it all. Reach out to tmosso at thewatchbox.com for purchase and pricing of everything you see here.